In a world where an Omega's only duty is to submit, I was expected to kneel. When the most powerful and feared Alpha King in the world laid his claim on me, I was expected to accept. But I gave him a one-word answer that would shatter his pride, break his kingdom, and seal my fate. My name is Brenna, and this is the story of how my rejection forged a king. Chapter 1. The Great Claiming. The heavy scent of pine and anticipation hung over the Blood Moon Collective, a thick blanket woven with the primal energy of hundreds of wolves. It was a tangible thing, a thrumming in the air that vibrated deep in Brenna's bones and made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. From the shadows of a great oak at the edge of the ceremonial clearing, she watched the preening alphas and hopeful betas. Their nervous energy was a stark contrast to her own desperate wish for invisibility. Here, to be overlooked was to be safe. She was a whisper in a storm of roars, a pale moonflower hidden beneath ferns, and she sent a silent, fervent prayer to the moon goddess to remain so. Then he arrived. Alpha King Drogo did not walk into the clearing. He commanded it as if the very earth submitted to his will. The boisterous energy of the pack didn't just quiet. It collapsed into a reverent, fearful silence, suffocated by his sheer presence. His arrival was a physical force, a wave of raw power and dominance that pressed the air from Brenna's lungs and made her feel small, insignificant. He moved with the fluid, lethal grace of a born predator. His broad shoulders and the hard, uncompromising set of his jaw, a testament to the brutal strength that kept a dozen rival packs cowed and broken. He was everything the legends claimed: magnificent, terrifying, and absolute. Drogo ascended the ceremonial rise, his dark eyes sweeping over the assembled wolves with an unnerving stillness. There was no warmth in his gaze, no connection, only the calculating assessment of a king surveying his assets. He took the smooth, obsidian claiming stone from the pack elder, its polished surface reflecting the hungry, flickering torchlight like a captured piece of night. A low hum of anxiety rippled through the she-wolves, a dangerous cocktail of fear and a desperate, foolish hope. For an Omega like Brena, there was only the cold certainty of dread. To be claimed by anyone was a loss of the quiet, solitary freedom she cherished. To be claimed by him would be an annihilation of the soul. His gaze continued its relentless sweep, dismissing face after hopeful face with an almost insulting brevity. Brenna held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to shrink into the shadows, to become nothing more than a patch of darkness the eye would slide over. But a predator always finds the flicker of movement, the faint, panicked scent of fear. His eyes, sharp and piercing as shards of obsidian, cut through the crowd and locked onto hers. In that instant, the roaring fires, the rustling leaves, the very breathing of the pack, it all fell away into a vacuum. There was only the king's gaze, a cage of intent from which she could not escape. A collective gasp rose from the pack, a single sharp intake of breath that was the sound of Brenna's world, and her carefully constructed invisibility, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Chapter 2. The Word That Broke a Kingdom. A path cleared through the sea of wolves as if by an invisible divine hand. 2 of Drogo's sentinels, hulking brutes with faces like carved stone, moved to flank her. They didn't touch her, but their immense proximity was a command more potent than any words. Every instinct in Brenna's body screamed at her to run, to bolt into the swallowing darkness of the forest. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, encased in the leaden weight of her new reality. She forced herself to walk, each step an eternity, moving from the comforting anonymity of the shadows into the merciless, dancing glare of the firelight. As she approached the ceremonial rise, she kept her eyes down, fixed on the packed earth, unable to bear the collective weight of hundreds of stares. She heard the whispers, the sharp intakes of breath. She felt like a lamb being led to a slaughter she had somehow stumbled into, her pulse a frantic drum against the suffocating silence. She stopped at the foot of the rise, finally forcing her head up to look at him. Up close, the raw power radiating from him was almost dizzying. She could see the faint, arrogant lines etched around his mouth, the chilling confidence in his eyes that spoke of a life without challenge, without denial. He was every bit the monster from the Whispers, a king forged in fire and fear, a master of wolves who knew only dominance. And yet, for one breathtaking, heart-stopping second, she saw something else. A flicker of something raw and untamed that wasn't just cruelty. It was a loneliness so profound, a stark isolation that mirrored her own hidden feelings. It was the faint, tragic echo of a man who could be more, a leader who could be truly great if he could only conquer the snarling beast within himself. That fleeting glimpse of his potential didn't soften her fear, but it solidified her resolve. It gave her the strength not to break, not to bow. Drogo extended his hand, the obsidian stone resting heavy and dark in his palm. It was an offering, a demand, a final, unbreakable command. The entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her inevitable submission. He expected her to kneel, to offer her neck, to accept her fate as his property. Brenna looked at the stone in his hand, a symbol of bondage, then back to his face, a mask of tyranny. She opened her lips, and a single word fell into the charged silence, soft yet sharp enough to cut through the thick tension like a shard of glass. No. It was a whisper that carried like a thunderclap across the clearing. Drogo's hand froze midair. The pack's collective shock was a physical wave that washed over Brenna, threatening to buckle her knees. But she held his stunned gaze, her own voice gaining a sliver of strength as she delivered the poison of her reason. I will not be claimed by a tyrant. Chapter 3. A King's Humiliation. For a long, agonizing moment, the world stood still. The crackling of the bonfires and the rustling of the wind in the pines were the only sounds in a universe that had forgotten how to breathe. Drogo's face, a mask of regal certainty just seconds before, was now a study in complete, uncomprehending disbelief. His eyes, which had held the power of life and death, were wide with a shock so profound it bordered on comical. He stared down at Brenna as if she had sprouted wings and spoken in a language long dead, the word no, an alien concept his mind utterly refused to process. The Alpha King, ruler of the Blood Moon Collective and conqueror of the Northern Territories, had been denied, in public, by an Omega. Then the disbelief began to crack. It splintered like thin ice under a hammer blow, revealing the molten, uncontrollable fury that lay just beneath the surface of his composure. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, a primal, guttural sound of wounded pride that vibrated through the very air. The atmosphere grew thick and heavy, charged with the ozone of his impending rage. He looked past Brenna, his wild gaze sweeping out at the sea of faces staring back at him, his warriors, his elders, his subjects, and for the first time, he saw not their fear, but their utter astonishment. He saw the silent, damning judgment in their wide, unblinking eyes. He, the Alpha of Alphas, had been brought low not by a rival's blade in glorious combat, but by an Omega's quiet word. The humiliation was a venomous serpent, sinking its fangs deep into his soul and pumping him full of poison. "What did you say?" he snarled, his voice a blade of serrated steel, each word dripping with menace. Brenna met his fury with a calm she didn't know she possessed. She did not repeat herself. Her silence was her damning answer. And in that silence, his last thread of control shattered completely. With a roar that shook the very trees and sent birds scattering from their branches, he lunged forward, not at her, but at the ceremonial stone. He snatched it from the elder's hand and hurled it with all his might into the darkness of the forest, the symbol of his authority rejected and violently discarded. His chest heaved, his eyes blazing with a hate that was hot enough to melt stone. "You dare!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the clearing like a pronouncement of war. "You dare defy me! You are nothing! You will leave my lands now, or my wolves will have your hide. You are banished! If you are seen within our borders by sunrise, you are to be hunted down and killed like a rat." It was a desperate, violent attempt to reclaim the power she had just so effortlessly stolen from him. Chapter 4. The Long Road into Exile. Brenna didn't wait for a second command. The king's decree was still echoing through the stunned silence when her survival instincts, honed by a lifetime of staying unnoticed, took over. She turned and ran. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. She plunged into the cold, dark embrace of the forest, the life she knew burning to ashes behind her with every frantic footfall. Branches whipped at her face, their sharp leaves stinging her skin. Stones and roots bruised her bare feet, but she didn't feel them. The only thing she felt was the thunder of her own heart and the imagined sound of paws pounding the earth behind her. She ran with the primal terror of the hunted, expecting at any moment to feel the snap of jaws on her heels, the brutal, bloody end to her defiance. The first few days were a blur of panicked, sleepless flight. She moved by night, a frantic shadow flitting through the trees, and rested in short, fitful bursts during the day, hiding in thorny thickets or shallow ravines. She ate what little she could forage, bitter roots that tasted of dirt and sour berries that twisted her stomach into knots. Every shadow was a sentinel, every snap of a distant twig a pursuing warrior. The fear was a constant companion, a cold, hard knot in her belly that never loosened. But the jaws never came. The hunters never appeared. Slowly, painfully, the all-consuming terror began to recede, beaten back by the gnawing ache of hunger and the deep, soul-crushing exhaustion of a body pushed far beyond its limits. As the miles stretched on, and the familiar scent of her home pack faded completely from the air, a profound change began to take root in her. The fear that had driven her was hardening, calcifying into something else entirely. It became a cold, hard resolve that settled deep in her bones, a shield against the despair that threatened to consume her. She had been an Omega, a creature of submission and quiet, invisible existence, but that Omega had died in the fire of the king's fury. The she-wolf, who now limped through the unforgiving wilderness, her clothes in tatters, was someone new. She was a survivor. She was the echo of a single word that had shaken a kingdom. She would not just live to spite the king who had banished her. She would live to prove to herself that a life of freedom, however harsh and lonely, was worth infinitely more than a tyrant's golden cage. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Silverwood. Weeks bled into a month, each day a new battle for survival. Brena was a ghost of her former self, gaunt and scarred, her clothes little more than mud-stained rags. The soft, timid Omega she had once been was buried beneath layers of grime, grit, and a weary toughness she'd earned with every painful step. She had learned the hard lessons of the wild, how to read the tracks of small game, how to find the clean water that wouldn't sicken her, how to sleep in the hollow of a fallen log and feel safe from the chill of the night. She had finally crossed the unmarked border into the Silverwood, a dense, mist-choked forest that felt ancient and unwelcoming. The air here was different, heavy with the unfamiliar scent of a strange pack. She knew she was trespassing, a lone, scentless wolf in a well-guarded territory, and the knowledge was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that kept her on edge. Her desperation finally outweighed her caution. Her throat was raw with thirst. She found a small, gurgling stream and knelt, cupping her hands and drinking the cool, clear water. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was in that moment of relief, her guard down for just a second, that a twig snapped loudly behind her. She was on her feet in an instant, a crude, sharpened stick clutched in her hand, her body tensed for a fight she knew she couldn't win. 3 large wolves emerged from the trees, their silver-gray pelts making them seem like apparitions in the gloomy twilight. They weren't from the Blood Moon Collective. Their scent was of damp earth and river stone, a scent of home that was not hers. They circled her slowly, their lips curled back to reveal sharp, white teeth. Their low, rumbling growls were not a challenge, but a final, deadly warning. She was caught. There was no negotiation. Prodded by the snout of the largest of the three, she was forced to walk, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. They marched her through the woods to a sprawling makeshift camp nestled in a hidden valley. Wolves of all ranks stopped what they were doing to stare as she was paraded through, their eyes filled with suspicion and naked hostility. She was dragged before a large central tent where a stern-looking alpha sat skinning a rabbit, a long, jagged scar running down the side of his face. He looked up, his cold eyes narrowing as he took in her ragged state and the defiant, exhausted tilt of her chin. Brenna met his gaze without flinching, preparing for a final fight, unaware that her fate, which had already twisted so violently, was about to take another, even more unexpected, and far more complicated turn. Chapter 6. A Beta's Kindness. Brenna stood before the scarred alpha of the Silver Creek pack, his cold, calculating eyes stripping away her defenses. He saw not a refugee, but a liability, a scentless stray who smelled of trouble and the faint, dangerous aroma of a king's rage. She could feel the weight of his judgment and the hostility of the wolves surrounding her. This was it, she thought, the end of her desperate flight. She had run from a tyrant only to be torn apart by his wary neighbors. She braced herself, her hand still clutching the sharpened stick that felt so pitifully inadequate. She would not die begging. But before the alpha could pass his sentence, a new figure stepped forward from beside his tent. He was tall and lean, with a gentle face and warm hazel eyes that held none of the brutal calculation of his leader. "Father," the wolf said, his voice calm and steady, a soothing balm on the raw tension. "Let us hear her story before we pass judgment." This was Lucian, the alpha's son and the pack's beta. He moved to stand between Brena and the others, a subtle act of shielding that spoke volumes. The scarred alpha grunted, a sound of reluctant acquiescence. Lucian turned his gaze on Brena, and for the first time in months, she was looked at not with contempt, pity, or lust, but with simple, open curiosity. "You are an outcast," he stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact. "Why?" Brena hesitated, the story of her defiance a dangerous truth to share. But in the quiet patience of his eyes, she saw a chance. She told them of the claiming, of the tyrant king, and of the word that had sealed her exile. When she finished, a tense silence fell over the camp. The alpha's face was grim, unwilling to invite the wrath of a neighboring king. But Lucian's expression was one of quiet admiration. "To defy an alpha king is an act of immense courage, not a crime," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. He turned back to his father. "She is no threat to us. She is a survivor. I will take responsibility for her. I will offer her my protection." The alpha studied his son for a long moment before giving a curt, dismissive nod. The immediate threat had passed. Brena looked at Lucian, at the man who had spoken for her when no one else would, and felt a fragile, unfamiliar seed of trust begin to take root in the barren wasteland of her heart. She was safe, for now, all thanks to a beta's kindness. Chapter 7. The Ghost in the Halls. In the suffocating, opulent grandeur of his castle, Drogo was being tormented. The great stone halls, once a symbol of his absolute power, now felt like a prison of his own making. Silence was his enemy. In the quiet, he could hear her voice, a phantom whisper echoing off the cold stone, repeating the word that had become his own personal curse, tyrant. Brena was a ghost haunting every corridor, her defiant eyes staring back at him from every polished surface. He saw her in the flickering firelight, a shadow of the Omega he had banished so carelessly, her condemnation following him like a second skin he could not shed. The kingdom continued to function. His subjects still bowed. But the foundations of his world had been fractured by a single, quiet no. He had tried to bury her memory in the brutal routines of his rule. He drilled his warriors until they collapsed. He rode his fastest stallions to the point of exhaustion, and he drank himself into a stupor night after night. But she was a persistent specter, immune to his rage and his wine. One night, pacing restlessly before a large silver-gilded mirror, he stopped. He forced himself to truly look at his reflection for the first time since the claiming. He saw the powerful build, the crown on his head, the familiar sneer of arrogance on his lips. But beneath it all, he saw the truth of her accusation. He saw the cold, empty eyes of a man who ruled through fear because he was too weak to inspire loyalty. He saw not a king, but the monster she had named. The realization was not a slow dawn, but a violent impact, a shard of ice driven deep into his chest. All his conquests, all his power, all the fear he commanded. It was all a brittle facade, a monument to his own inadequacy. He had the strength to break packs and bend alphas to his will, but he had shattered at the quiet defiance of one Omega. He was a tyrant because he was hollow inside. The thought brought him to his knees on the cold stone floor, the weight of his self-disgust a crushing physical force. This, he realized, was the beginning of his true punishment. Not banishment, not a challenger's blade, but a painful, soul-deep reckoning with the man in the mirror. Chapter 8. A New Beginning. Under Lucian's gentle and constant watch, Brenna began to heal. The rhythms of the Silver Creek pack were a soothing balm to her frayed soul. Here, there were no grand ceremonies or displays of dominance, only the quiet, steady beat of a community working together. The she-wolves taught her which roots were safe to eat. The children showed her the best places to find sun-warmed river stones, and the hunters shared their kills without demanding tribute or submission. It was a life of simple contentment, a world away from the oppressive, fear-laced atmosphere of the Blood Moon Collective. Her days were filled with purpose, weaving warm blankets for the coming winter and helping the pack's healer sort herbs. Lucian remained her steadfast guardian. He made sure she always had the choicest cut of meat at meals and a place by the warmest part of the fire. He walked with her through the woods, his presence a comforting shield against the stares of the few who still viewed her with suspicion. He never pushed, never demanded. His kindness a gentle tide that slowly washed away the grime of her past trauma. With him, she felt seen, not as an Omega to be claimed or an outcast to be feared, but simply as Brena. Her shoulders, once perpetually tensed for a fight, began to relax. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes was replaced by a soft, clear light. One afternoon, while mending a net by the creek, one of the younger wolves told a clumsy joke, and Brena laughed. It was a real, unrestrained sound that bubbled up from deep within her, surprising them both. The sound felt unfamiliar, a forgotten melody from a life lived long ago. She looked up to see Lucian watching her from across the clearing, a warm, pleased smile on his face. In that moment, surrounded by the peaceful hum of her new life and bathed in the warmth of his affection, she allowed herself to believe. She started to believe that a life of quiet contentment, a life free from kings and claims, might be possible for her after all. The thought was as terrifying as it was beautiful. Chapter 9. The first crack in the armor. The dispute was a familiar one. The Stone River Pack, a small but stubborn clan to the east, had once again diverted a shared waterway to irrigate their own failing crops, leaving the outlying farms of the Blood Moon Collective dry. It was an act of aggression, a clear challenge to his authority. Drogo sat on his throne, the heavy stone cool beneath his hands, and listened to the reports. His council, a collection of grizzled, battle-hardened alphas, waited with grim anticipation. They knew their king. They knew his methods. In the past, he would have already dispatched a legion of his fiercest warriors. There would have been blood, a swift and brutal lesson in the price of defiance. They expected him to give the order to attack, to crush the Stone River Pack into submission as he had done so many times before. Drogo looked at the faces of his advisors, saw the bloodlust in their eyes, and felt a wave of revulsion. This was the kingdom he had built, a nation of wolves who saw violence as the first and only answer. He thought of Brenna, of the disgust in her voice as she called him a tyrant. "I will not be claimed by a tyrant." Her words were a brand on his soul. An attack would be easy, satisfying a primal urge for dominance. It was what they expected. It was what the old Drogo would have done without a second thought. But the old Drogo was a monster, and he was desperately trying to kill that monster before it consumed him completely. He took a deep breath, the silence in the hall stretching to a breaking point. "Send a messenger," he said, his voice quiet but firm, devoid of its usual rage. "Tell them we will not send warriors. We will send engineers. We will help them build a proper irrigation system, one that serves both their pack and our own." The shocked silence of his advisors was more profound than any roar. They stared at him as if he had grown a second head. Diplomacy? Aid? These were not the tools of their king. In their stunned, disbelieving faces, Drogo saw the first, tangible proof of his transformation. The tyrant was beginning to crumble, replaced by something new, uncertain, and infinitely more difficult. It was a small step, a single crack in the armor of his rage, but it felt like the most significant victory of his entire reign. Chapter 10. A shadow in the sun. The afternoon sun was warm on Brenna's skin, dappling through the canopy of leaves as she and Lucian walked along the bank of the bubbling creek. This had become their ritual, a quiet time at the end of the day to talk and simply be with one another. A sense of peace had settled over Brena, a feeling she was beginning to trust. She felt Lucian's hand slip into hers, his touch warm and familiar. For the first time, she didn't flinch away from a male's touch. She leaned into it, allowing herself this small comfort. It was a perfect, tranquil moment, a testament to the new life she was building, a life she owed in large part to the gentle Beta walking beside her. As they rounded a bend, they saw another male from the pack, a young hunter named Kale, making his way toward them. He was kind-hearted and friendly to all, and he offered Brenna a wide, respectful smile as they approached. "Brenna," he said, his voice cheerful. "The healer asked me to tell you the willow bark you gathered is perfect. She sends her thanks." Brenna smiled back, a genuine expression of warmth. "Thank you for telling me, Kale." The exchange was innocent, a simple moment of pack camaraderie. But Brenna felt the atmosphere shift instantly. Lucian's hand, which had been holding hers so gently, tightened. It wasn't painful, but the pressure was sudden and unmistakable, a gesture of ownership. She glanced up at him. His smile was still fixed in place, but it was tight now, strained at the edges. It didn't reach his eyes, which had turned cool as they rested on Kale. "We were having a private walk," Lucian said, his voice smooth, but with an undercurrent of steel that made Kale's smile falter. The young hunter nodded quickly and hurried on his way. The moment passed in a heartbeat. Lucian's grip loosened, his smile softened, and he resumed their conversation as if nothing had happened. But Brenna couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. The brief, possessive grip, the coldness in his eyes. It was a deeply unsettling echo of the dominance she had fled. A shadow had just fallen over her sunny, peaceful world, and for the first time, she wondered if she was truly as free as she had thought. Chapter 11. A King's Penance. The great stone halls of his castle, once a source of immense pride, now felt less like a fortress and more like an echoing, opulent tomb. Every shadow in the long corridors seemed to twist into her form, and every gust of wind whistling through the parapets seemed to whisper the words she had used to brand him. Tyrant. The title clung to him like a suffocating shroud, and he found he could no longer bear its crushing weight. The crown felt heavy on his brow, not with the burden of leadership, but with the sharp, cutting guilt of his cruelty. For weeks, he had locked himself away, wrestling with the phantom of Brenna's judgment. He had shattered his claiming stone in a fit of rage, but she had shattered his entire sense of self with a single word. In the ruins of his pride, a painful, unfamiliar conscience was beginning to grow, and it demanded a penance he did not know how to give. He began his atonement not with grand pronouncements, but with quiet, deliberate steps into the parts of his kingdom he had always ignored. He traded his royal finery for the simple, unmarked leathers of a common hunter, his crown for the anonymity of a deep hood. The first time he walked through the cramped, muddy streets of the lower citadel, the silence that fell was thick and heavy with fear. People scattered, mothers pulling their children inside doorways, the memory of his volcanic rage still a fresh, unhealed wound on the pack's psyche. But he did not roar. He did not command. He simply listened. He stood before the blacksmith whose forge he had once threatened to demolish over a late shipment of spearheads and asked, his voice low and devoid of its usual arrogance, about the health of his ailing son. He visited the weaver's den, a place he'd only known as a name on a tithe ledger, and listened as the elders spoke of dwindling resources and the unfair taxes he had imposed. He heard their grievances, their quiet despairs, and for the first time, he saw them not as subjects to be managed, but as a people he had profoundly and systematically failed. Slowly, over many days, their ingrained suspicion gave way to a wary curiosity. He ordered the royal granaries opened, distributing food not as a king's largesse, but as a silent apology for his long neglect. He sat with his council and, to their utter astonishment, tore up the aggressive, predatory pacts he had made with neighboring territories, replacing them with treaties of mutual support and shared borders. With every decree, with every quiet, humbling conversation, he was dismantling the reign of fear he had so carefully constructed. His guards watched him with bafflement, his advisors with undisguised shock. They thought he was reforming his kingdom for political gain, but Drogo knew the truth was far deeper. He was reforging his very soul, piece by painful piece, driven by the ghost of an Omega who had shown him the monster in his own reflection. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that none of it would matter if he never had the chance to tell her. Chapter 12. The Gilded Cage. The Silver Creek Pack was a haven, a soft green dream after a long and brutal nightmare. The air was clean, the wolves were kind, and the constant thrumming fear that had been Brenna's companion for so long had finally, blessedly receded. Under Lucian's gentle and unwavering watch, she had started to truly heal. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment, and the simple, joyous act of laughing no longer felt like a foreign language her body had forgotten how to speak. Lucian was the patient architect of this newfound peace. He was attentive, kind, and unfailingly protective, anticipating her needs before she even voiced them. He brought her the sweetest berries from the highest, sunniest bushes and the softest, warmest pelts for her bedding. He was, in every conceivable way, the antithesis of the tyrant she had fled. And yet, a tiny, dissonant chord had begun to vibrate beneath the surface of their idyllic harmony, a note so faint she tried desperately to ignore it. It began with things so small she almost convinced herself she was imagining them. When she found herself in a light-hearted conversation with other unmated males in the pack, Lucian would invariably appear at her side, his arm sliding possessively around her waist. His smile never faltered, but his eyes would turn as cold and hard as river stones for just a moment. He praised her beauty, the graceful way she moved, the melodious sound of her laugh. But when she offered a practical opinion on reinforcing the camp's defenses during a communal meal, he would chuckle softly and dismiss it with a gentle patronizing, "Leave the worrying to the alphas, my dear." He encouraged her to practice her weaving, a skill he deemed suitably feminine, but flatly discouraged her from joining the hunting party's training exercises, insisting it was far too dangerous for someone as delicate as her. His kindness was a wall being built around her, brick by invisible brick, isolating her for her own protection. One evening, he gifted her a beautiful necklace of polished, iridescent river stones. As he fastened the clasp at the back of her neck, his fingers brushing her skin, he murmured, "So everyone knows you belong to me." The words were meant to be a comfort, a promise of his unwavering protection, but they landed on her skin like the cold, heavy steel of a shackle. She looked around at the peaceful valley, at the life she had almost convinced herself was a dream come true, and saw the truth with a sickening, heart-dropping clarity. Lucian's affection wasn't a shelter, it was a cage. A softer, prettier cage than the one Drogo had offered, gilded with kindness and sweet, reassuring words, but a cage all the same. With dawning, suffocating horror, she realized that she had not escaped her fate after all. She had only traded one form of control for another. Chapter 13. Whispers of a Changed Man. The world beyond the sheltered, misty valley of the Silver Creek Pack was a distant rumor, a story told by others around a crackling fire. Brenna's life had shrunk, contracting to the gentle rhythms of the camp and the perimeter of Lucian's ever-watchful gaze. But the world had a way of seeping in, of trickling through the cracks in her gilded cage. Traveling merchants, their carts laden with goods and even more valuable gossip, would sometimes pass through on their way to the coast, and Brenna found herself lingering by the fire, a silent shadow, listening to their tales. They spoke of skirmishes in the southern territories and prolonged droughts in the east, but the stories that made her stop breathing, that made her heart hammer against her ribs, were the ones that came from the north, from the lands she once called home. They spoke of the Blood Moon Collective, and they spoke, with a sense of bewildered awe, of King Drogo. At first, she refused to believe them, convinced it was a trick. The merchants told impossible tales of a king who walked among his people in the muddy lower sectors, who listened patiently to the lowliest Omega's complaint as if it were a matter of state. They spoke of draconian laws being repealed overnight, of ancient bloody feuds being settled not with bloodshed, but with fair mediated negotiation. They described a ruler who was measured, just, and almost unnervingly wise. "He is not the same man he was a season ago," one grizzled fur trader said, his eyes wide as he shook his head in wonder. "It is as if his rage has been excised, cut out of him. He rules with a quiet strength now, a sad strength, some say, as if he carries a great burden." Brena would retreat into the woods after hearing these tales, her mind a chaotic, churning battlefield. It couldn't be true. It was a strategy, a lie to lure his enemies into a false sense of security before the inevitable slaughter. Yet, the stories were maddeningly consistent. Every traveler, every scout, every messenger brought a new piece of the same impossible puzzle. Could a man like Drogo, a creature of pure, animalistic impulse, truly change so fundamentally? The tyrant she had defied was a force of nature, a storm of rage and pride. But the king they described sounded more like the fleeting, tragic flicker of potential she had seen in his eyes that fateful night. The lonely, isolated man who could be great. A desperate, treacherous hope began to take root in the scorched earth of her heart, a tiny, fragile green shoot pushing up through the ashes of her past. She found herself staring north more often than not, her gaze lost on the horizon, wondering, with a terrifying mix of fear and longing, if the monster who had broken her was somehow, impossibly, putting himself and his entire kingdom back together. Chapter 14. The Beta's Claim. Lucian was no fool. He felt the subtle, yet undeniable shift in Brenna. He saw the way her eyes would grow distant when she thought he wasn't looking, her smile not quite reaching them anymore. He noticed her quiet, almost desperate interrogations of travelers and the new, restless energy that hummed beneath her skin like a trapped bird beating its wings. He sensed her pulling away, her spirit retreating to a place of memory and turmoil where he could not follow. With a possessiveness he mistook for love, he interpreted her inner conflict as simple uncertainty, her longing for a life she'd lost for a deep-seated need for security. His solution, therefore, was not to understand her, but to anchor her, to bind her to him so tightly and so publicly that she would never dream of drifting away. He decided to act, to turn his unspoken, assumed ownership into a formal, unbreakable pact. The moment came during the pact's relaxed evening meal, under the warm, silver glow of a rising full moon. The atmosphere was peaceful, full of the easy camaraderie of a pack at peace with the world. Lucian stood, tapping his knife against a stone cup to command silence. A hush fell over the assembled wolves, their faces turning towards him. Brenna, sitting beside him, felt a sudden, cold premonition, a knot of ice forming in the pit of her stomach. He smiled, a broad, confident expression that was meant for the entire pack, but was aimed directly, pointedly at her. "My friends," he announced, his voice booming with a pride that made her skin crawl. "For many weeks, we have all been blessed by Brenna's presence. She has brought light to our home, and even more light to my heart. It is time to make her one of us, forever. I will be honored to solidify her place among us. I will claim her as my mate at the next full moon." The pack erupted in a chorus of joyous howls and whooping cheers. Wolves slapped Lucian on the back, and the she-wolves crowded around Brena, hugging her and offering their heartfelt congratulations. She was trapped, pinned in place by a suffocating web of happy expectations. She forced a smile, her face feeling like a brittle porcelain mask that might crack at any moment. Over the heads of the celebrating pack, she looked at Lucian. His smile was triumphant, possessive. He was looking at her not as a partner, but as if she were a prize he had finally, definitively won. In his eyes, she saw no love, no respect for her journey, only the cool, calm satisfaction of acquisition. The gentle gilded bars of her cage had just slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the lock had clicked firmly, irrevocably into place. Chapter 15. The Search. The kingdom was healing. The fields were peaceful, the markets were full, and the thick, choking fear that had once been the currency of his realm was slowly being replaced by a fragile, tentative trust. Drogo had done everything a king was supposed to do. He had repaired the damage he had wrought, he had listened to his people, and he had ruled with a just and steady hand. He had become the king Brenna's defiance had demanded he be. By all accounts, his soul should have been at peace, settled and content. But it was not. His kingdom was stable, but his inner world remained a desolate, wind-swept wasteland, haunted by the memory of her terrified eyes as she fled into the unforgiving forest. He knew, with an unshakable, soul-deep certainty, that true redemption could not be found within the borders of his own lands. It had to be sought, and it had to be earned. His advisors argued against it vehemently, their faces etched with concern. "You cannot leave, Your Majesty," his chief elder pleaded, his voice earnest. "The pack is stable because you are here. Your presence is the cornerstone of this new peace. To leave now is to invite chaos." They did not, could not understand. The peace felt hollow, a beautiful, elaborate lie he was telling himself every single day. True penance required more than just fixing what he had broken. It required facing the person he had wronged. He stood before his council, no longer the tyrant who commanded, but the leader who explained. "My brother Kale will rule in my stead," he said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying an authority that no longer needed to be bolstered by rage. "I must undertake a journey. This is not a matter of the crown, but a debt owed by my own soul." He packed no royal guard, no fine provisions, no banner of his kingship. He left the castle at dawn, a lone figure slipping through the morning mist, dressed in the simple, worn leathers of a common hunter. He carried only a water skin, a well-honed knife, and the crushing, ever-present weight of his regret. He had no destination, no map to follow. He only had the scattered whispers he'd heard from travelers, the faint, months-old trail of an outcast Omega who had vanished into the wilderness. He wasn't searching for a mate to claim. That arrogant, foolish king had died that night at the claiming ceremony. He was searching for a woman to whom he owed an apology so profound he didn't have the words for it yet. He needed to find Brenna, not to drag her back, but simply to look her in the eye, confess his sins, and tell her that she was, and always would be, completely and utterly free from the memory of the monster he had once been. Only then, he thought, could his own torment finally begin to cease. Chapter 16. The eve of the claim. The moon, a sliver shy of full, hung in the night sky like a judge's sickle, a celestial reminder that Brenna's time was running out. From the entrance of her tent, a dwelling far more comfortable and spacious than any she had ever known, she watched the Silver Creek pack bustle with festive preparations. Laughter echoed through the valley, carried on the crisp evening air. They were celebrating her. They were celebrating the final, formal sealing of her fate, and the joy of it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, threatening to suffocate her. Lucian had given her this tent, just as he had given her the softest pelts to sleep on and the warmest spot by the fire. Every comfort was a thread in a silken net, and she could feel it drawing tight around her, gentle and inexorable. She retreated inside, the scent of dried herbs and pine filling her senses. This life was safe. It was a life free from the gnawing hunger of exile and the ever-present fear of being hunted. Lucian was kind, attentive, and admired by his pack. Any she-wolf would consider herself blessed to be his mate. But Brena knew the truth that lurked beneath the surface of his gentle affection. It was the kindness of a zookeeper for a prized exhibit. He cherished her beauty, but not her mind. He protected her body, but sought to contain her spirit. She thought of the cold flash in his eyes when another male spoke to her, the subtle way he steered her away from any activity he deemed too rough, the patronizing smile he gave when he dismissed her opinions. She was not his partner. She was his most precious possession. Her mind, against her will, drifted north to the king she had once known. The whispers of his transformation were a constant, unsettling hum in the back of her mind. Had he truly changed? The question was a dangerous one, a treacherous path of what-ifs. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized the profound irony of her situation. She had rejected Drogo not because he was cruel, but because he denied her a will of her own. He had sought to own her through power and intimidation. Now, here, on the eve of another claiming, she was about to surrender that same will to Lucian, who sought to own her through kindness and control. She had survived a king's rage and the unforgiving wilderness. She had learned to be resourceful, resilient, and strong. Was she really going to trade that hard-won strength for a life of quiet, comfortable submission? The thought was a splash of icy water, shocking her out of her resigned despair. No, she would not trade a tyrant's roar for a keeper's whisper. She didn't know how, but she would not let this claiming happen. Chapter 17. The Scent on the Wind. The fire crackled, a small beacon of defiant warmth against the vast, indifferent darkness of the northern forests. Drogo sat hunched over the flames, the rough leather of his traveler's clothes a far cry from the silks and furs of his castle. He was leaner now, the excess of royal life stripped away by weeks of hard travel, leaving only the hardened muscle of a wolf honed by a singular, desperate purpose. Every day was a battle against the fading hope that he would ever find her. He had been following whispers, ghosts of rumors, the faint trail of a legend about an outcast Omega who had defied a king. He was chasing an echo, and the loneliness of his quest was a constant, aching companion. He was a king with no kingdom, a wolf with no pack, a soul with no anchor. That night, his luck changed. 2 fur traders, their faces weathered by the wind, and their eyes sharp with the cunning of their trade, sought to share his fire. Drogo, no longer the arrogant king who demanded fealty, welcomed them with a nod and a gesture toward the flames, offering a piece of the rabbit he had roasted. They spoke of trade routes, of territorial disputes, and then of the news from the packs they'd passed. "Big celebration brewing in the Silver Creek pack," one of them said, chewing thoughtfully. "The Alpha's son, Lucian, is finally claiming a mate tomorrow night. Found himself an outcast Omega, they say. A real beauty, but a strange one. No scent to her, and a history she doesn't speak of." The piece of roasted meat fell from Drogo's numb fingers. An outcast Omega. Silver Creek. The pieces slammed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow. It had to be her. The world, which had been a vast, trackless wilderness, suddenly snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. He was no longer just searching. He was now in a race against a ticking clock. He stood abruptly, his sudden movement startling the traders. The weariness that had settled deep in his bones was burned away by a clean, hot surge of adrenaline. "Thank you for the news," he said, his voice a low, urgent rumble. He kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing the flames. He didn't have time for rest. He didn't have time for caution. The traders watched, bewildered, as the strange, intense hunter strapped his pack to his back and stared south, his eyes glowing with a faint, predatory light in the gloom. He broke into a run, his long, powerful strides eating up the dark ground. The scent was on the wind now, a trail of destiny he could not ignore. He would not be too late. He could not be. Chapter 18. An uninvited guest. The day of the claiming ceremony dawned bright and clear, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The festive energy in the Silver Creek camp was palpable, a cheerful hum of activity and anticipation. Brenna, however, felt none of it. She remained in her tent, a silent participant in a celebration that felt more like a funeral for her freedom. Outside, the pack was joyful, but inside, Brenna was planning. Her desperation from the night before had solidified into a cold, hard plan. She would feign illness just before the ceremony, create a diversion, and slip away into the woods under the cover of the ensuing chaos. It was a flimsy, desperate hope, but it was the only one she had left. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the valley, a ripple of unease disturbed the festive atmosphere. The pack's border sentinels sent up a low, guttural howl, not of alarm, but of deep uncertainty. A scent had been detected on the wind, a scent that did not belong. It was the scent of an alpha, but one of such overwhelming power and dominance that it set every wolf in the valley on edge, their hackles rising instinctively. It was the scent of a king. The Silver Creek Alpha, his scarred face grim, immediately began organizing his warriors, fearing a territorial challenge on this most important of days. "Lucian," he commanded, his voice sharp, "take 5 of our best, go to the northern ridge, see who dares approach my lands on this day." Lucian, dressed in his finest ceremonial leathers, swelled with pride. On the day he was to claim his mate, he was being sent to confront a potential challenger. It was a perfect opportunity to display his strength and authority before the entire pack, and especially before Brena. He gathered his warriors, his expression one of supreme, arrogant confidence. He strode to Brena's tent, pulling back the flap without asking permission. "There is a rogue at the border," he announced, his chest puffed out. "Do not worry. I will deal with this intruder swiftly and return for our ceremony." He left before she could respond, a confident warrior marching off to defend his territory. He and his wolves reached the ridge, the powerful scent growing stronger with every step. And there, standing alone beneath the ancient pines, was the source. It was not a rogue. It was King Drogo, looking not like a conqueror, but like a weary, haunted traveler whose journey had finally brought him to the end of his world. Lucian's confident sneer froze on his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock, which quickly curdled into possessive rage. Chapter 19. The Interruption. The ceremonial fire roared to life, a great column of flame and sparks that clawed at the darkening sky. The entire Silver Creek pack was gathered, their faces painted with joy and anticipation, forming a tight circle of bodies that felt like the closing walls of a trap to Brenna. Her plan had failed. Lucian, upon returning from the border, had been a storm cloud of repressed fury. He had refused to tell his father who the visitor was, insisting it was a lone wolf he had sent packing. But his eyes were wild, and he had gripped Brenna's arm with a bruising intensity, pulling her towards the fire. "We will do this now," he had hissed, his gentle mask completely gone. "You will be mine, and no one will ever take you from me." Now she stood before the Alpha, Lucian's hand like a manacle on her wrist. The ceremony began, the Alpha's deep voice rumbling through the ancient rites, speaking of loyalty, strength, and the sacred, unbreakable bond between mates. Each word was another shovelful of dirt on the grave of her freedom. Brena felt herself dissociating, a ghost floating above her own body, watching this quiet, smiling tragedy unfold. The Alpha turned to his son, his voice swelling with pride. "Lucian of the Silver Creek, do you claim this she-wolf to protect and provide for her? To bind your spirit to hers for all your days?" Lucian's answer was a possessive growl of triumph. "I do!" He turned to Brenna then, his handsome face alight with a victor's smile. He released her wrist only to cup the back of her neck, his thumb pressing into the sensitive skin, preparing to pull her forward for the claiming bite. The Alpha's gaze fell upon her, kind and expectant. "Brenna," he began, "do you accept this claim? Do you choose to bind yourself to—" "Stop!" The voice was not a roar, but it struck the clearing with the force of a thunderclap. It was a voice forged in command and broken by regret. Every head whipped around in stunned unison. Stepping out of the deep shadows beyond the firelight was King Drogo. He was thinner, his face etched with the weariness of his long journey, but his presence was an undeniable force of nature. He wasn't looking at the shocked Alpha or the snarling Beta. His eyes, filled with a universe of sorrow and a desperate, pleading hope, were fixed only on Brenna. The joyous celebration shattered. The air crackled not with celebration, but with the electric, deadly tension of an imminent, impossible confrontation. Chapter 20. A King's Plea. The world, which had been a cacophony of celebration, was now a vacuum of shocked silence. Then, the spell shattered. Lucian, recovering first, erupted in a snarl of pure, possessive fury. "You have no right," he bellowed, shoving Brenna behind him as if she were a trinket to be shielded. "Get out of our lands, tyrant!" The Silver Creek warriors began to close in, their hands on their weapons, their expressions a mixture of fear and aggression. The situation was a spark away from exploding into a full-blown battle, but Drogo seemed oblivious to the threat. He ignored the bared teeth of the warriors and the enraged posturing of the Beta. His entire world had contracted to a single point: Brena. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hands held open at his sides in a gesture of peace, a gesture of surrender. "I am not here for you, Lucian," he said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the rising tension. His gaze remained locked on Brenna, a silent communication passing between them over the heads of the snarling wolves. "I am here for her." He took another step, and then another, creating an invisible, sacred space around them in the very heart of the hostile crowd. He stopped a few feet from her, his broad shoulders slumping with a weariness that seemed to come not from his journey, but from the very depths of his soul. He looked broken, and in his brokenness, she saw more strength than he had ever possessed as a tyrant. "Brenna," he began, his voice raw, stripped of all its regal command. I am here to apologize. The admission silenced the entire clearing. You were right. I was a tyrant. I was a monster who ruled through fear because I was too hollow to rule any other way. I banished you not because of your defiance, but because your courage showed me my own cowardice. There is no excuse for what I did. For the pain I caused you, for the fear you endured. I am sorry. The apology was a confession, a baring of his soul before two packs. He asked for no forgiveness. He simply offered his shame as a penance. Then he took a deep breath, his eyes pleading with her. I have changed because you forced me to, and I am here to humbly ask for a second chance. I, Drogo of the Blood Moon Collective, wish to claim you as my mate, if you will have me. He did not command, he did not demand. He asked. He laid his crown, his pride, and his heart at her feet, and the entire world held its breath, waiting for her answer. Chapter 21. A Beta's Fury. Drogo's plea, raw and stripped of all pride, hung in the charged air. For a breathless moment the world was frozen, the two packs watching the impossible drama unfold. Then the spell shattered. Lucian, who had been standing in stunned disbelief, finally broke. His handsome face, a mask of gentle concern just moments ago, twisted into a grotesque snarl of pure, unadulterated rage. The kindness he had curated so carefully was incinerated in a blast of wounded pride, revealing the ugly, possessive beast that had lurked beneath all along. This was not the disappointment of a spurned lover. It was the incandescent fury of a collector whose most prized possession was being addressed by another. "She is mine!" he roared, the word tearing from his throat, raw and guttural. He lunged, not at Drogo, but at Brenna, his hand shooting out to grab her arm, to physically drag her back behind him. It was a crude, instinctual act of ownership, a desperate attempt to reassert control over his property. But before his fingers could even brush her sleeve, Drogo moved with a speed that seemed to defy his size. He didn't attack. He didn't even draw a weapon. He simply placed himself between them, a solid, immovable shield. The king's back was to Lucian, his entire being focused on protecting Brena from the very man who had promised her safety. The silent, defensive maneuver was more insulting to Lucian than any blow. It dismissed him as a non-threat, a child having a tantrum. Completely unhinged by the public humiliation, Lucian lost the last of his control. With a maddened howl, he launched himself at Drogo's back. "I will kill you, tyrant!" he screamed, his attack sloppy and fueled by pure rage rather than skill. It was pitiful. Drogo didn't even turn fully. He simply shifted his weight, catching Lucian's flailing arm and using his own momentum to spin him around and send him stumbling into the dirt. Drogo hadn't thrown a single punch, yet the fight was already over. Lucian lay in the dust, defeated and exposed, his beautiful lies stripped away to reveal a creature of primitive, brutish ownership. Brenna stared at the scene, a cold, sickening clarity washing over her. She had been so captivated by the gilded cage that she hadn't seen the monster who held the key. The kind, gentle Beta was just a tyrant with better manners. Chapter 22. The Omega's Voice. As Lucian scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of dirt and humiliation, a profound and powerful calm settled over Brena. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. All that remained was a cold, sharp certainty. The world had been trying to choose her fate for her. First a tyrant's command, then a keeper's claim. Now 2 alphas stood before her, one consumed by a rage she knew all too well, the other broken by a regret she was only just beginning to understand. But this was not their moment. It was hers. With a deep, steadying breath, she took a single step forward, physically placing herself between them. The movement was a declaration in itself, and both males fell silent, their attention snapping to her. She faced Lucian first, her gaze clear and unwavering. She did not raise her voice. There was no need for anger. There was only the quiet finality of the truth. "The kindness you showed me was a leash, Lucian," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned the onlookers. "You did not want a mate. You wanted a beautiful bird for your cage. I will not be caged." She saw the flicker of shocked comprehension in his eyes before it was swallowed again by his sullen fury. She had seen his soul, and there was nothing more to say. She dismissed him not with a curse, but with a turn of her back, an act of finality more potent than any blow. Then she faced Drogo. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the entire story of his agonizing penance in the weary lines on his face and the profound sorrow in his eyes. He was not the monster who had banished her. He was the man who had walked out of the wreckage of his own making. "You were a tyrant," she said, her voice softer now, but just as firm. The word had to be spoken, the truth acknowledged between them. "You were a king who ruled with a fist because you did not know how to rule with a heart." She took another step, closing the distance between them, her own hand rising as if to touch the face of this impossible, changed man. "A beast cannot change what it is. But you have proven you are not a beast. You are a man who has learned that true strength is not the power to claim, but the courage to be worthy of being chosen." She stopped just before him, the entire world seeming to hold its breath. "I rejected a tyrant. I will not reject a king." Chapter 23. The True Claim. Brenna's declaration, "I will not reject a king," hung in the silent, charged air. She took the final step, closing the small distance between her and Drogo until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She looked up into his eyes, which were wide with a disbelief so profound it was almost painful to witness. He had come here expecting, at best, to deliver an apology and walk away, forever haunted. He had prepared himself for her hatred, her fear, or her indifference. He had never, in his wildest dreams, prepared himself for her acceptance. He was a king brought to his knees not by a challenger's blade, but by the overwhelming grace of a second chance he knew he did not deserve. He was so stunned, so completely undone, that he was incapable of movement. So, Brena acted. In a move that shattered 1,000 years of tradition, she, the Omega, initiated the claim. She reached up, her hands surprisingly steady, and gently cupped his face. She rose onto her toes, tilting her head to the side and exposing the pale, vulnerable column of her throat. It was not an act of submission. It was an offering. A conscious, powerful choice given freely and without reservation. It was a gesture of ultimate trust, a silent statement that she saw the man he had become and was not afraid. The invitation was clear, and it finally broke through Drogo's paralysis. A shudder racked his entire body, a tremor of pure, unadulterated emotion. With a low growl that was not of dominance but of profound, aching reverence, he lowered his head. He did not take her with the brutal, possessive bite of a conquering alpha. His touch was impossibly gentle, his teeth barely grazing her skin as he marked her as his. The moment the claim was sealed, it was as if a dam of cosmic energy burst. A palpable wave of golden light and warmth erupted from them, washing over the entire clearing. Every wolf, from the highest alpha to the lowest omega, felt it. A deep, resonant thrum in their very bones that spoke of a bond that was more than just a union. It was a destiny fulfilled, a fractured piece of the world snapping perfectly back into place. The magic of it was undeniable, a power far greater than a simple ceremony. The claim that had been rejected by force was now sealed by choice, and in its making it had become something new entirely. Something legendary. Chapter 24. A Queen's Return. The journey home was not one of a king and his prize, but of two partners walking side by side. They spoke for hours, their words weaving a new future as they traveled the long road back to the Blood Moon Collective. Drogo learned of the terror and loneliness of her exile, and she learned of the ghosts and regret that had haunted his castle halls. He did not ask her to be his queen. He told her he needed her to be his equal. "A king who cannot listen is a king who will fail," he said, his voice thick with the weight of his past mistakes. "My strength is nothing without your wisdom, Brenna. You will not walk behind me. You will not stand in my shadow. You will rule at my side." Their arrival at the citadel was a spectacle. The pack had known only that their king had left on a mysterious penance. To see him return with the very Omega he had banished, the woman who was now a legend in her own right, sent a shockwave of disbelief through the capital. They saw her walking beside him, her head held high, their hands clasped together. They saw the way their king looked at her, not with possession, but with a deep and abiding reverence. And as the two of them ascended the steps to the great hall, the pack felt the lingering, resonant magic of their unique bond. There were no challenges. There was only a slow, dawning, collective awe. The Alpha who had mastered his rage had returned with the Omega who had mastered his heart. Brena returned to the Blood Moon Collective not as a claimed mate, but as a queen. Together, she and Drogo reshaped the very foundations of their society. Her compassion tempered his strength, and his authority gave voice to her convictions. They established a new council where every rank, even the Omegas, had a representative who could speak without fear. Their rule was one of justice, fairness, and a strength that came not from fear, but from unity. Their story became a legend, a tale told to pups for generations to come. It was the story of the tyrant king who was brought to his knees, not by war, but by a whisper. It was the story of the outcast Omega who found her power not in submission, but in defiance. It was the legend of how a gentle, unbreakable heart had forged the greatest king their people had ever known.